Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan, MSP. This is Ukraine War news update video for the 3rd of April 2023. Let's get to our opening gambit, which is the Ukrainian release figures for the Russian losses for the day before, all the usual caveats. Inaccurate propaganda, say the critics. I think these are indicatively useful. They give us a good indication of what took place on the day before. If I'm not too interested in the total figures, as in of the whole year, they are going to be somewhat inaccurate, but I think these figures are more accurate than critics give them credit for, and I try and give you rationale for that, as I have done over the months. Not too much information on that front though today. The claims are 610 liquidated personnel. I think that is lower than it has been over the recent 2 or 3 weeks, although the last 3 or 4 days has seen far lower figures, because I think the Russian offensive has culminated. And I think there's plenty of evidence for that. ISW, for example, and other Western outlets are concluding the same. 1 tank, 7 APCs. So 7 APCs is obviously quite useful. 1 tank, less than, well, if you look at 3,619 is a claim here. Visual confirmation of around 2,000 tanks lost. So, you know, this isn't that far out, because the visual confirmation is your absolute bare minimums. It has to be that's your benchmark of saying, right, at least 2,000 are definitely taken out, because we have seen visual footage of that. So of all, the question is how many more have been destroyed or taken out that there is not visual evidence of. You know, what is the ratio of visual to non-visual pieces taken out. Of course, we might never know that, or at least we'll only find it out long after the war is ended, I'm sure. So anyway, you can see the 1 tank is not a high number of tanks lost on a daily basis. 7 APCs, 7 artillery systems. There's been this consistent degradation of the Russian artillery provision over the last couple of weeks, and I think there has been a concerted effort to take out both anti-aircraft warfare systems and artillery systems. And this is something I have been saying now for 3 weeks, possibly 2 to 3 weeks. And it appears that my speculation has been vindicated by that being repeated in a number of outlets, and I'll come to that in a second. We're going to talk about the anti-aircraft systems in a second, but 1 is still useful. As you can see, this war has been going on for sort of 400 days, so the average is less than 1 anti-aircraft warfare system a day. So even if you have 1, that is a pretty good day. Sometimes these systems are very expensive systems. When you see 2 or 3, it's a very, very good day for the Ukrainians. 13 drones, 16, that usually indicates that there was some kind of drone strike attacks the night before. 16 vehicles and fuel tanks, 2 pieces of special equipment. We've seen an uptick in these over the last week or 2. So I think the Ukrainians are going for things like radar systems, electronic warfare systems, artillery and anti-aircraft systems, very especially, and it could be in advance of a forthcoming of a counteroffensive or 2. Right, let's go and look at other stuff to do with hits and losses. And just to prop up my theorizing just now, Trent Telenko says joint suppression of enemy air defenses, which is SEED. Suppression of enemy air defense is what you do normally at the beginning of a war, or, you know, to try and take out the enemy air defenses, but enemy aircraft as well, so that you can get air superiority and be able to do combined arms maneuvering. That never really happened, so the airspace has been contested throughout the entirety of the war. But ahead of a counteroffensive, you would expect the Ukrainians to be trying to take out enemy air defenses. So anyway, joint suppression of enemy air defenses by Ukrainian military forces on a large scale against Russian ground-based air defenses, GBAD, has near-term operational implications, for which see here. So this is interesting. February to March, there was a strong emphasis on destroying Russian air defense. Wow, it's like sometimes I get imposter syndrome. Like, who the hell am I to comment on all this? I'm not an expert in all this. I don't know what I'm talking about. And then sometimes I guess you could say a broken clock is right twice a day. But you know, sometimes I get vindication, and I give myself a clap on the back, because, you know, it turns out that I might know sometimes what I'm talking about, but I don't know. You guys be the best guess at that. So anyway, last time it was so high was in last August. So of course, prior to the previous attacks, you know, Kharkiv, Kherson, there was this kind of activity. And then we're seeing this kind of activity again now, which is what you would expect, as I say, given a counteroffensive looming. But it appears that they definitely are. It seems very likely that they are specifically targeting enemy air defense systems and such like. Okay. Right, the biggest news from yesterday that has been hitting the socials has been this explosion that took out a military blogger who was a pretty well-known one as well, hosting an event in St. Petersburg. An explosion ripped through the cafe, so you can see it here in this video. This is the moment it hit, and you can see there was quite some explosion taking place there. Well, let's go to Tim White to let us know what happened. A brief synopsis. This is the immediate aftermath inside the cafe where the war blogger Vladan Tatarsky is said to have been killed. It was a hallmark of a professional hit. This was the moment he was given the bomb. So this is him there, and the bomb was inside a statuette of his likeness. A ripple of applause as he receives what will eventually kill him. This is a victim of the bomb blast in St. Petersburg. Vladan Tatarsky was a popular pro-Russian war blogger, and this is believed to be the moment which caused his death. It's said that the present contained explosives. The number of injured has risen to 16. I don't know, it might have been surpassed now. In addition to Tatarsky's death, the prosecutor of St. Petersburg has already arrived at the site of the deadly explosion. This was last night. Street food bar number 1. Now, that video was taken 5 minutes ago. This was yesterday. Interestingly, that was I think it either is a Yevgeny Prigozhin bar, or it was. He's given it to someone else. So there are links between this guy and Prigozhin. A swift response today to the scandal. That's something else. Here we go. Somewhat predictably, Russia's already managed to find a Ukrainian to blame for the killing of Tatarsky, the convicted thief turned soldier turned blogger. Maria Yerun from Ivano-Frankivsk has been detained. She supposedly handed over the statue full of explosives. There is some kind of it's a bit murky as to whether people have been arrested and whether they're still looking for people and all sorts of stuff, so that you get different claims at the moment. First, who would benefit from the assassination? Russia says Ukraine, but really, what is to gain from Ukraine to kill one quite well-known person in Russia's second city? I think nothing. Who else is to gain? Tatarsky will certainly have made enemies along the way, both in his military career and likely other jealous bloggers, but only police would be able to access messages, emails, documents, and speak to friends to access any potential threats. Could Putin's government gain from the killing? Well, funny you should ask that. Tatarsky gained some notoriety by instantly declaring Russia would kill, rape, and plunder as needed to defeat Ukraine. Come the war crimes later, this did not look good and likely angered some. Furthermore, Tatarsky nailed his allegiance grovelingly so to Prigozhin and the Wagner Group. He was, I believe, a mouthpiece for Putin's chef, the wannabe president. Prigozhin likely told him what to write on occasions as he criticized Russia's army and MOD. The Kremlin will also benefit now in another way. They just launched a desperate military recruitment drive which seemed lifeless. Doubtless now they could stoke up hate Ukraine rhetoric and get more gullible cattle fodder to sign up. Think that's far-fetched? Well, please remember that the Kremlin used a fake crucifixion to stoke hatred of Ukraine when it needed volunteers in 2014, just as Russia looked likely to lose the Donbass war there and then. And then let's remember that Putin came to power in 1999 as acting president. He was an outsider to win the coming election until an extraordinary event, terrorist bombings of Russia. Immediately, Chechens were blamed, and Putin started another Chechen war, sending his popularity soaring as a man to protect Russians. Very few Russians over 40 have ever lost this view, except one of the terrorist bombs didn't go off. The apartment bombings killed 300 and injuring over 1,000, but not in Ryazan. Here, there's enough evidence to suggest the whole plot was organized by the Kremlin itself. Watch this documentary, The Story, and he posts Assassination of Russia blowing up Russia HQ documentary. Anyway, I recently read Killer in the Kremlin by John Sweeney. I so advise you guys to go out and read that. Get the audiobook where he narrates it himself, and it is again a fascinating synopsis of what happened around the Georgia Chechen wars as well, and how the Kremlin did exactly those things. They had their fingerprints all over a whole series of bombings or very dodgy reactions to bombings and all sorts of stuff. So this is well within their wheelhouse, this kind of activity. And my bet would be that this is not Ukrainian activity, but is probably some kind of Russian activity. Not for sure, it might not be, but I think I would put a safe bet on this being the activity of the Russians. So there you go. They say he was given a figurine with 200 grams of TNT inside it. You can be sure this could only have happened with inside knowledge. There are Russian infightings going on. This is Tendar saying this. This is how it looks. And this is how it looks like. Somebody sent Prigozhin a message. So there's a lot of thought to do, a lot of theorizing. This has to do with the kind of Kremlin machinations between the MOD and Prigozhin. Right, Julia Davis, who does a lot of looking at Russian propaganda, says that he was also reportedly being investigated, and goes back to October. Military correspondents and bloggers reportedly being investigated, and she named him as one, and that was all the way back in October. What else can we say? Well, okay, gives you a bit of an indication of what this Tatarsky was like. So this came from September last year on an RT show, Beautiful Russia. This propagandist argues that Russia shouldn't worry about the way events like Bucha are being perceived or covered in the West. Instead, he says Russia should lay into that. Yes, that's how we are. We'll show you even more. Fear us. So that's nice. I just translate what is said here for you. I'll read out the subtitles because it gets onto Tatarsky. So this guy says, there is blood all over the screen, and the title Butcher, a feature film. I understand that all of this is trash, crap, intellectual and cultural waste, but I think with horror that it will make an impression, and there will be a total consensus about Butcher. How can we overcome this damn Butcher? What do we need to do to win? And this guy says, Tatarsky says, let me interrupt you. What do we need to do to win? Let me interrupt you. We need to use our enemy's strength against him. A German watching Butcher with the screen flooded with blood. A German could watch only if he still has electricity, says a woman. He will remember stories his grandparents told him, says Tatarsky. And we should add to that and say, yes, that's how we are. Fear us. Fear us, guys. You want to see us this way? We'll show you even more. So that's Tatarsky. That he's not a nice human being. He has been assassinated in St. Petersburg. The question is, who did it? Talking about more certainly assassinations by collaborators. A car bomb has gone off in Melitopol, where Maxim Zubarev is probably dead. He's at least been admitted as to be seriously injured. He was claimed to have been killed before, I believe, and it turned out to be alive. So there's been attempts on him before, but my theory is that he is probably dead. The resistance has critically injured another collaborator. Maxim Zubarev decided to work with Russia when made head of occupied Yakimivka, around 30 kilometers or 20 miles southwest of Melitopol. So he is, that car bombing, that's what happened to his car. And another big bit of news on the socials last night was Prigozhin claiming the Wagner troops to have captured Bakhmut, and he means legally. So in this bizarre video, he says he's by the main council building in the center and will raise a Russian flag which belonged to Tatarsky. So this is him again. This is connecting to that assassination in St. Petersburg. Prigozhin says the town is legally ours, then admits Ukraine army is in the west. So you got this video footage of him unfurling a flag and this going supposedly on an administrative building in Bakhmut. And I told you about how those kind of buildings may have symbolic value to some, but they are just rubble, realistically. And indeed, more footage of the Wagner flag with reference to Tatarsky being put on the administration building. It is typical Wagner planting a flag on top of a piece of rubble. And so this is the footage, and you can see really that is exactly what is taking place. Just just a flag on a destroyed building. Well, whoop-de-doo. Well done, you guys. However, this does indicate that there are advances within the center of Bakhmut. So, if you are pro-Russian, you can take some kind of solace that this does have. This is indicative of something, which is that the Russians are moving forward in the center of Bakhmut. Just an interesting bit of footage that's come out yesterday, over the last couple of days. This is a military commissar down around Mariinka saying, in order to take the farm in Mariinka, and I don't know if this is that piggery that's to the north of Mariinka that I've talked about over the last couple of weeks, or not. It's a fur farm, so I don't think that's the same thing. Well, it's not the same thing, but I don't know whether that in reality is the same place. We spent 1,480 shells. So I've talked about how many shells are needed to take out the shells per people, or the shells per meter that are needed when the Russians particularly are doing their offensives, because they're much more indiscriminate with their shelling. We spent 1,480 shells and 6 loitering ammunition. We took the farm by storm and gave it back because our counter battery fight is not at the level to hold positions. Artillery beats us and drives us out of the positions we occupied. The reason why this kind of claim is so important is because it shows that everywhere along the front line, different stories are being told. As in, you cannot extrapolate across the front line what's going on in Bakhmut to what's going on everywhere else. Mariinka is different from Bakhmut. And you might have some Russians complaining that they're getting hammered by artillery in one place, and Ukrainians in Bakhmut claiming we don't have enough artillery, we don't have enough ammunition, we are short. And so what's going on here? Like, I thought that you just told us that was the case over there, and now you're telling us this is the case over here. Well, actually, there are just different things going on along the front line. It's really difficult to make generalized statements, or it can be a bit dodgy. So anyway, the translation, what he says, in the Donbass, the Russian army continues to slip due to the inability to cope with the artillery of the armed forces of Ukraine, which, having NATO satellite intelligence and high accuracy, talked about this yesterday. The Russian voices in my thread saying, how can Russians be losing more people when we are using more shells? And we know that artillery kills most people in the war. And I said, well, here are a bunch of reasons. One of the reasons I talked about was the fact that the Russians use their shelling indiscriminately, 1,480 shells. And here this guy says that the Ukrainians have satellite intelligence and high accuracy. So there you go. That basically, that's your main argument there. So, jog on and all that. Knocks out the Russians from the newly occupied positions, the Russian military commander Alexander Sladkov said. In order to take the fur farm in Mariinka, we spent 1,480 shells and 6 loitering ammunition. We stormed the fur farm and gave it back because our counter-battery combat is not yet at such a level as to ensure the retention of the positions taken with the help of our artillery. So our artillery uses kind of like saturation or indiscriminate shelling, and then we take a place, but we just can't hold onto it. That is, the artillery hits us and drives us out of the positions we occupy. Therefore, we cannot take Mariinka either. We advance head-on there as fast as we can. We are moving forward. We are already in a high-rise quarter, but we cannot cover it completely because we are capturing strongholds and we cannot hold them, said the military commander. It's interesting that he previously said, same guy back in March, Mariinka is the oldest object we have ever studied. We've been fighting for over a year. Mariinka is a school of our infantry, a kind of training ground, and a heavy burden of memory. If she could be surrounded, she'd be off the table a long time ago. In the city, we go from home to home. In the surrounding fields, it's not possible to gain a foothold everywhere today. So I've talked a lot about Mariinka, about how they like Bakhmut and like Avdiivka want to encircle it, but they find it difficult because these strongholds exist out in these fields that you think look irrelevant, but actually are super important and allow cities to remain defended. Okay, so the Russians have been in the hots and lists, hits and losses. Goodness me, spoonerisms. Yesterday morning, the Russians attacked Konstantinivka with S-300 missiles and Hurricanes. So these are the multiple launch rocket systems. There are different types of Hurricanes. They do supposedly have these long-range Hurricanes. Is it Hurricane S? But there's very little evidence of them being used. I mean, these are supposed to have longer range than the HIMARS, but however, hits in Ukraine, operational security means that you very rarely hear about, when you hear about things like this, is because the Ukrainians kind of want you to. So these are hits on residential buildings here. So 6 people were killed, 9 were injured, 17 high-rise buildings, 18 private houses, kindergartens, hospital, and an administrative building were damaged, said the head of Donetsk Regional Military Administration. Now, that's because the Ukrainians want you to know about this, which is the kind of indiscriminate shelling of civilian buildings and infrastructure. If they do hit military targets, you generally won't hear about it. But that's not to say it doesn't happen. So the pro-Russian voices do have a point, which is, why don't you talk about this? Well, it's quite difficult because actually the footage doesn't come out because it's really tight, as you would expect, really tight restraints on getting out footage of actual genuine military targets being hit by the Russians. So I just thought I'd balance the books a little bit there. Right. Talking about military aid, I talked again, a moment of vindication here. I've talked the last couple of days about the importance of Rheinmetall and people like Papinger, I think it is that Papinger, the head of Rheinmetall, that's a Russian defense corporation, but the importance that they play, the central pivotal role that they're playing in the European provision of weaponry to Ukraine, but not just provision of weaponry, but the fixing the updating of older pieces of equipment like Leopard 1s, getting them ready to go to the front, making sure the Leopard 2s are good to go, but also fixing stuff from the front line. So this is super important. A military maintenance and logistics hub of the German arms maker Rheinmetall is set to be built in Romania near the border with Ukraine, or set up, and it's expected to begin operation this month. It will service SPGs, Leopard 2s, Challenger tanks, Marder IFVs, and other military vehicles operated by Ukraine. So they're obviously going to be doing work on behalf of, things like, British equipment like the Challenger. We're going to struggle to get out decent logistics chains and whatnot, and maintenance provision to and in Ukraine. Well, if Rheinmetall can do that on our behalf, then obviously that's a great advantage to the Ukrainians. Romania is here, and it will be somewhere near there. So this is one of the routes into Ukraine. We've got Poland, Slovakia, and Romania, your 3 main entrance points for military aid. Okay, moving on. Another group has finished training on the AS-90. So these are 1990s. Self-propelled guns, British guns. We are now getting hold of some Archers from Sweden. We've got hold of some that were due, I think, to go to Norway. We've got hold of them as a kind of stopgap because we have given basically most of our self-propelled gun capacity to Ukraine. There are some 33 of these going out there, and there have been waves of people being trained. Another group has finished their training. That's really good news. Several Polish MiG-29s have already been sent to Ukraine. We've seen some of the Slovakian ones that have been sent, taking off from Slovakia to fly to Ukraine. This is great. Right. If you haven't watched Perun's latest video that came out, I think Saturday, on the Russian air and Ukrainian air forces, go and watch it. It is absolutely brilliant. As ever, his videos are always consistently good. So please go and watch that. MiG-29 is going to be so useful, but going forward, there will eventually need to be provided some kind of NATO plane. But these are they're being given enough to replace all the MiG-29s they've previously lost, which is fantastic because that puts at least their MiG-29 fleet back to pre-war levels. Absolutely excellent for the Ukrainians. But they will need, if we talk about things like ATACMS, we need to get Ukraine longer-range missiles. The best way to get longer-range missiles is to give them planes that have the capability of sending longer-range missiles from the air. That is your best way of doing it. So really, the problem, as Perun says, is that giving planes has been put down a priority list because it's always, we need to get them ammunition, we need to get them tanks. And these things have greater immediacy, needs of immediacy there in Ukraine. But actually, if you're talking about the war as a whole, you need to be giving them planes. You need to be giving them planes to give them the ability to hit targets way behind the lines. Anyway, as far as Russia go, well, this is what military aid are they getting? I know, I don't mean to be so facetious, but they are obviously going to struggle. China's a game changer if they ever decide to provide weaponry to Ukraine, but at the moment they're just having to dig out their old stuff. This is apparently a T-12 gun snapped in Evpatoria. These were manufactured in the 1960s and 70s and phased out in the late 80s. Honestly, it will be a surprise if it fires correctly with any accuracy. So this is the kind of weaponry they're having to dip into. Interesting that Hungarian Deputy Foreign Minister is arrived in Ukraine and visited Zahaltsi, a town just west of Borodyanka, which was heavily affected in the invasion a year ago. Hungary has reportedly made money available to rebuild and repair buildings, including a kindergarten. So this is, and I'm going to talk, I will mention him again in the geopolitics section in a second, but this is really good news at Hungary, because, I talked about how the main entrance to Ukraine is through Poland, Slovakia, Romania. Obviously, Moldova are not very rich, and a bit of a problem going on with Transnistria. But Hungary is your other option. But Hungary have been historically pro-Russian, or at least, being very difficult geopolitically speaking. So if we're starting to see movement with them, there's a really good TLDR news video on how Russia are losing friends around the world. And how even places like Serbia and Hungary are starting, and Turkey are starting to go, not too sure. Okay, so this, I just want to include this because it's such a sweet put down. This is like drop mic moment. So, not that she would have read this, but Margarita Simonyan, who's this horrible human being, said that I doubt that Zelensky's read even one book in his entire life. Like, this is just obviously pure propaganda, and if you really believe that, then you are more stupid than you are both stupid and evil. So, as Prune60 here says, yeah, he speaks 3 languages, has a law degree, a book on his speeches has been published. He was elected president, and the world knows his name. They do not know Margarita's name. Sadly, I do though. But I mean, it's just like drop mic moment. He's probably not read a book in his life. He's got a law degree, and he speaks 3 languages, and he's had a book published of his own stuff. So, jog on. Right, on other sort of odds and sods, this is a very interesting article in The Guardian. Panic and emotional pain as alleged deep cover Russian spies vanish. It's another story about Russian spies, but probably quite early in their embedding. 2 of them being found that apparently are married to each other, but both having long-term relationships they're in separate countries, one in Greece, one in Brazil, and having romantic relationships themselves. They're that deeply embedded. So Campos Vitic was allegedly a fake identity, said Greek media, citing sources in the Greek intelligence service. According to those reports, he was not, as he had told his girlfriend, the child of an Austrian father and Brazilian mother raised by his grandparents in Vienna. He was allegedly a Russian illegal, a deep cover spy working for an elite intelligence program who had been trained for years in Russia to be able to impersonate a foreigner. He was allegedly secretly married to another illegal who posed as a Greek-Mexican photographer named Maria Tsala, and ran a knitting supplies shop in Athens. Both had, it was claimed, been dispatched on a decades-long mission to serve Vladimir Putin's intelligence services. At least 6 such suspected illegals have been unmasked in various locations over the past year, suggesting there could be one or more defectors passing information to the West. Alternatively, Russian intelligence may be asking more of its illegals, thus exposing them to additional risk, because so many of its legal spies based in Russian embassies have been expelled over the war in Ukraine. I reported on this in one of my segments some time ago, talking about how actually they're really struggling, the Russian intelligence services, because they've had so many diplomats expelled, so many spies, all kind of like spies that they're spies, sent back to Russia, sent packing, that they're now having to rely on people who aren't quite as good, or like Russian illegals that they have positioned that could be used in espionage, having to rely on them, or they're taking people that they've been expelled from one country, putting them in another country, but then the other country kind of knows who they are, type thing. So they are struggling. Quote, "We have very little doubt that they were married," said the Greek official, adding that it was an unusual case. He claimed that the pair had engineered meetings in Greece, Cyprus, and France in recent times, possibly romantic encounters mixed with espionage catch-ups. Interviews in Greece and Brazil suggest both halves of the couple left emotional devastation in the wake of their hurried departures. Both had long-term romantic partners in their cover identities who had no suspicion they were involved with Russian spies. The couple spoke Portuguese together. Campos Vitic had an accent that those who met him struggled to place. I couldn't say whether it was Russian or German or Turkish sounding, said one longtime acquaintance in Rio. Campos Vitic talked about his past rarely and in vague terms, explaining his strange Portuguese enunciation with reference to his upbringing in Vienna. Campos Vitic and Sala, or Mr. and Mrs. Shmurev, if the Greek authorities' suspicions are correct, are probably already back in Russia, but at least 4 suspected illegals are now in detention, including a Russian with a Brazilian cover identity jailed in Brazil after a decade-long mission in which he obtained a master's in the US and gained an internship at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. It talks about a few others. Sala and Campos Vitic may have been in an earlier embedding stage of their missions, which could have gone on for decades if not detected. Quote, "We did not have any evidence she carried out any espionage in Greece. The only illegal thing for which she could be accused was using false documents," said the Greek official of Sala. However, she travelled widely and intelligence services across Europe are investigating her movements. At the time of his disappearance, Campos Vitic had been making the final payments on a new headquarters he had acquired for the firm in downtown Rio. It was housed in a commercial building less than 50 meters from the US consulate. All very interesting stuff. So this is the kind of thing that's going on around the world. We have these Russian illegals embedded in otherwise, innocent-looking situations, but they possibly are very many of these sort of Russian illegals doing or potentially to do espionage work. Right. Getting on to geopolitics, something that, as I'm an economic centrist, social leftist, this kind of makes me sad that you on the right who are watching this, as I know half of you are, might be happy. But as far as Ukraine's concerned, this could be a bit of a risk. Sanna Marin has been a really big defender of Ukraine. She was the youngest. Was she the youngest leader of Finland ever at the age of 37, I think? So she became Finland's number one, but it's just been defeated by the Conservatives in a tight race. And actually, the Conservatives, in a 3-way race, they're all much of a muchness, but the Conservatives and the right-wing populists just pipped her centre-left. So actually, there's just over 50% are made up of Conservatives and right-wing populists. It looks like the rest of the parties kind of split the vote. But the interesting situation. Yeah, so there you go. That's her party then in the red, and then so it looks like there will be a coalition of the right there. So as far as Ukraine's concerned, the question is what will happen now. Now, the good news is that all 3 of those parties were pro-NATO, and I think they had to be, because I think you read the tea leaves in Finland. If you position yourself as anti-NATO, I don't think you would have succeeded in getting many seats there. So anyway, the right wing, and this is happening in a number of places in Europe. Sweden, it's happening in Sweden, it's happening in Italy. There is definitely this rise of the populist right in Europe, and for me, personally, that is a worry. You guys might feel different. Erdogan, now this is very interesting. I need to look into this. Erdogan says he wants to teach the US a lesson in the election. So there are upcoming elections. It could be an interesting set of elections here, because Turkey has had massive inflation. There have been loads of issues within Turkey. It should really be right for him being ousted. However, he's been in charge for so long, and he's again democratic backsliding, changing judiciaries and all the kind of things that you see in a lot of these nations. It is and the quelling of free speech in Turkey and opposition is a problem. This is not a fully functioning democracy, and so you would expect Erdogan to win again because he's rigged it. But essentially, the institutions and mechanisms of democracy there. But apparently, the US ambassador Flake has been visiting the opposition presidential candidate last week, and he now he's closed his doors to the ambassador Erdogan, and he wants to teach the US a lesson. So, as the US tries to geopolitically get their influence into the elections there, again, you can argue about whether that is good and right and proper, but it's what's been happening. the world over, and for a long time in politics, and the same with Russia in different countries, is like everyone wants their favored politicians to win that would align more with your own national interests. So you will support that, and you could argue that was happening in Ukraine prior to the 2014, the Euromaidan, where America were involved. But don't forget that Russia were involved as well. It's like lots of people say, "Oh, you had American politicians over, McCain and Newland who were over in Ukraine." This kind of NATO expansionism and US getting involved, therefore they started the war. It's like, yeah, but you do realize that Russia were doing the same, and even more insidiously, and then they actually put their troops in there as little green men in an illegal war. So doesn't work with me, that kind of argument, because it's ignoring that's happened, and that has been happening for both sides. If you think looking at this kind of Cold War scenario for in countries all around the world since the Second World War. Right, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs for Hungary came to Ukraine, as I've already reported, but that is really important geopolitically and gives you an indication of Hungary being okay. It's not Orban, but it's someone else. And it looks like the pressure from the EU and the US on Hungary is paying dividends there. And then Maria Buric, the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, has arrived in Kiev. So that's yesterday. Ukraine's first deputy first minister reported. So that is discussing further steps to restore justice and hold Russian war criminals accountable. That's really important. Then the Vice Chancellor, Germany's Vice Chancellor and Energy Minister Robert Habeck, has arrived in Ukraine. That was yesterday again on an unannounced visit. He and a small business delegation will focus on the energy sector. Super important. If you don't have energy around Ukraine, then you're going to struggle to function as a country, and obviously it's super important that is maintained. Right, and the last thing I'm going to say, geopolitically, this isn't so much like a news thing that's happened yesterday, but I think it's geopolitically important to mention. This is the idea that Russia had the criticism is that Germany, for example, and Europe in general, had all their eggs in one basket in terms of a complete dependence on Russia for hydrocarbons and for energy, and so when the war came along, it meant that Europe was screwed, and everyone was really quick to criticize Germany and other nations. But actually, do you know what? Would Britain have done the same if we'd been in this? If we weren't an island nation and had a different energy makeup, and we're Germany and we're right next to Russia and could get really cheap energy? Like, do you think we wouldn't have gone, "Oh no, we won't get cheap energy because Putin"? Like, you can bet your bottom dollar we would have been in the same situation. So I'm really reticent to criticize Germany. So many people criticize Germany, and it's easy to criticize when you're in a completely different situation, as if you would never have done the same thing. And I'm fairly sure, politically speaking, Britain would have made exactly the same decision if we had been in that same geopolitical situation. Anyway, that aside, we criticize European nations for having all their eggs in one basket and this dependency, but actually it works two ways. So Russia had all their eggs in the European basket, and but instead of from a demand situation, from a supply situation. So like, yeah, we're gonna spend all the money doing this, and kind of forgot like China and the East, and they did have some like plans in a pipeline, pun intended, but. What this war has shown is that actually, no, they had all really this overdependence on Europe. So, as Tendar says, probably one of the greatest ironies of the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine is that Putin was so hell-bent to have Nord Stream 2 finished that he completely discarded any long-term strategy for Asia, almost all pipelines to go to the West, and it is impossible for this to change in this decade. Putin, the master strategist, completely relied on that he will win in Ukraine and the entire world will go along with it. It also proves that revanchist fascism, as Ruski Mir, is that it never does any good to the people. Russia could have thrived if it had relinquished all imperial ambition. Industry would thrive and the very life could thrive. But all that they have now is a broken society and a stupid World War II fetishism, so on and so forth. And it's kind of true. It's like, well, had he not gone into war, Russia Russia could be well involved economically, geopolitically, globally now, and would be in a really strong position. If they're just not bothered with that and just thought about the economics and the fact that they are the gas station of the world to some degree, then they'll be in a whole different situation than they are now, which is basically screwed going forward. And that the master strategist, not so much. Anyway, thank you. That's today's, again, far too long news segment. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate your support, and I'll speak to you in the Frontline update forthcoming soon.